If we consider the firmware on the motherboard, we have the UEFI and the BIOS. There are some protection mitigation methods we can consider. You would want to enable secure boot if you have it and if it's compatible with what you're running. It's not perfect, but it is a layer of protection. You should make sure that UEFI secure flash is enabled. You should update the BIOS or the UEFI whenever there is a security patch. You should set a BIOS or UEFI password, and you should reflash your firmware if you suspect any problems, if that is indeed possible. But of course, reflashing firmware is always a little bit risky. If it goes wrong, your system can be inaccessible, but if it's the right firmware, it should be okay. But you can never guarantee it with some of these poor manufacturers. So what else can we do to mitigate against firmware rootkit? Well, there's only one antivirus service I know of that can check your firmware, and that's VirusTotal, although I'm sure others will catch up soon. You will need to extract the firmware from whatever device it is you're wanting to check. Now, there are some tools that can do that. Let me introduce you to them. For Mac OS, there is Darwin Dumper. Have a look at Butterworth BIOS security code and that zip file there. There's also Flash ROM, which you can get from here. There's the Python UEFI firmware parser. And there's also ChipSec, Platform Security Assurance Framework. And ChipSec, as an example, that works on Windows, Linux, and UEFI shell. And you can see a PDF for that here. This is Darwin Dumper as an example of a tool to dump the firmware. Now, when performing BIOS and UEFI and firmware dumps and uploading them to VirusTotal, make sure that you remove private information such as Wi-Fi passwords that might be stored in BIOS variables. And if you see here in Darwin Dumper, there's actually has an option to remove private information, which you can select here. And then with this tool, you can select what you want to dump and then click Run. It then produces the various files that you have selected. And then we can upload it to VirusTotal if we wish. It will look something like this. VirusTotal have reported that they were able to do the following. They can do ROM and BIOS detection and reporting. They can do strings-based brand heuristic detection to identify target systems. So we can see here MacBook Air, so UEFI firmware. There's extraction of certificates, both from firmware image and from executable files contained in it. PCI class code enumeration, following device class identification. ACPI tables tags extraction. NVAR variable names enumeration. Option ROM extraction. Entry point decompilation and PCI feature listing. Extraction of BIOS portable executables, identification of potential Windows executables contained within the images, and SM BIOS characteristics reporting. So that may or may not mean a lot to you depending on how much you know about hardware and firmware. So there you go, that is VirusTotal and uploading your firmware to it. This is the early days of attempting to detect problems with your firmware. And to be honest, this is quite basic. This is simple signature based, and as we know, signatures can easily change. So where we go with firmware and removing firmware malware is unknown at this point, but certainly we need to look strongly around prevention methods and also detection methods. And open source hardware is a potential mitigation.